What if the big Republican push for voter ID laws is not only a waste of time, but counterproductive? Should the GOP drop voter ID as a top political issue? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, men, the Heritage Foundation has chronicled several hundred election fraud cases from across the United States from the past 20 years. Heritage leads the fight, among others, for voter ID laws to make sure that every vote is counted, but only once. If you review the Heritage sampling of election fraud cases from across the country, you'll see that most cases involved absentee ballots, fraud by politicians, and false registrations. Few could have been prevented by voter ID laws. Actual voter fraud involves a person pretending to be someone he's not in order to cast more than one ballot on Election Day. Conservatives say that voter ID laws could ensure people vote just once at the proper precinct, and that ineligible persons like non-citizens and convicted felons would be prevented from voting. Donald Trump famously tweeted that he would have won the popular vote too in 2016 if Hillary Clinton had not received millions of votes from illegal aliens. But a new story in the New York Times reaffirms what several previous studies have shown, that voter impersonation of the kind voter ID laws seek to stop is exceedingly rare, virtually non-existent, and certainly not a factor in determining the outcome of the most recent nor of any national election. In addition, Democrats use GOP support of voter ID laws to buttress their accusations of racism against Republicans, since they claim that such laws disenfranchise people of color disproportionately. Indeed, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found that African Americans were 1.79 times more likely, and Latinos almost 2.5 times more likely than whites, to lack acceptable ID required under such laws. Among urban dwellers, automobiles and thus driver's licenses can be rare, and many poor people subsist in a cash economy and don't use banks, so that's at least conceivable that some don't have the necessary photo ID. A federal court in Wisconsin in 2014 estimated 300,000 registered voters in that state lacked the kind of identification required under the new state law. Now, Stephen Green, given that voter ID laws seem unlikely to change anything except to antagonize minorities and hand Democrats a weapon with which to attack Republicans, how does it make sense for the GOP to keep pushing voter ID as if the fate of the republic hangs in the balance?
Yeah, the fate of the republic doesn't really hang in the balance, does it? Republicans win plenty of elections. Donald Trump showed in this last election that if you make an appeal to minority voters, a Republican candidate can win them in numbers that are really crippling to Democrats. What we do have a problem with, though, are two things. One is our voter rolls are sadly out of date. You know, you've got what was it, Detroit, that turned in more ballots than they have registered voters. So we do have dead people or otherwise non-existent people voting, and we see this in Detroit, we see it in Philadelphia. We've got to get these voter rolls purged. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a federal issue, however, which could be used at the state level, as you suggest, to keep this out of the national spotlight. The other problem we have is that Democrats seem to be very good at manufacturing or, finding misplaced ballots when there is a contested result in a tight election. The most famous one in recent years, of course, being the contested election that put Al Franken in the Senate in 2008 and gave Barack Obama the 60th vote he needed for a filibuster-proof Senate. So we need to find a way to make ballots more secure so that they're harder to simply materialize in those exact numbers needed to put candidates over the top in these contested fights. But I think you're right. I'd never looked at it this way as a real insult to voters who feel like they're being targeted, whether that feeling is irrational or fair or not. That's politics, and it's something you definitely have to look into as you try and put together, dare I say it, a permanent Republican majority. Not that I believe in such things. It's cyclical.
Well, you know, my own Texas Governor Greg Abbott has called voter fraud rampant in the Lone Star State. Indeed, the Texas Attorney General received more than 360 allegations of voter fraud since 2012. 15 of those went to court, leading to 4 voter convictions. 4. The rest of the criminals were election officials and third-party volunteers from organizations. Now, Bill Whittle, no one's saying that voter fraud never happens, but rather that the good you want to do with voter ID laws is overwhelmed by the harm caused when a man is stripped of his right to vote for technical reasons. I know you love to stand on principle, but how does this issue really deserve the front burner treatment it gets from the GOP?
Because the issue isn't voter fraud, the issue is the rule of law. The issue is the rule of law and what constitutes law and what constitutes a country. It's got nothing to do essentially with voter ID laws. It's got to do with the fact that citizens of a country are allowed to vote, non-citizens are not. And what's so hard about this? This idea that poor people or black people or Hispanic people can't have IDs is an out-and-out lie. You can't accomplish anything in this country without a vote, without some kind of an ID. You certainly can't cash benefit checks, and you certainly can't go down and get a lotto ticket. So the whole thing I don't buy. And furthermore, if it's true that there are some people who just aren't bothered to go down and get a legal state ID, then this again comes to this Democrat idea that the Republic is just a series of benefits with no responsibilities whatsoever. I mean, you know, if you're saying to me that poor people don't have the ability to go and get a picture ID because they're poor, and if they're poor, they're almost certainly in this country on government assistance. If you're telling me that they can't take 2 hours how long does an ID last? 10 years?
10
15?
years, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So if you can't take 2 hours every 10 years to take a bus down and get your free federal or free state ID, then what does that tell you about it? You know, this is a case where maybe once we can lock the barn door before the horse escapes, but it's not even that. It's a question of the Democrats' constant, endless desire to see laws eroded, standards eroded, everything else eroded. They want to be able to do whatever they want. They want all of the benefits of a republic. They want all of the freedoms in a republic, and they don't want any of the responsibilities whatsoever. Let's not forget, by the way, if you don't have any kind of voter ID, any kind of picture ID, I don't think you get called for jury duty, right? I don't know how you would imagine. I don't know how I would imagine you would get called for jury duty if you don't have an ID, right?
I usually show them my daguerreotype.
Okay, fair enough. Show them your daguerreotype. However, what's that saying, you know? What's it saying? We're going to get all the benefits we want. We're going to have all the rest of half of America pay for the other half that's not working. And in exchange for this, we don't want to take 2 hours every 10 years to go down and get an ID. And furthermore, we don't want to do our civic duty when it comes to things like, you know, jury duty.
And Bill, and forgive me because I'm not really challenging that case that you're making there about whether it's possible for somebody to get an ID and how much of a burden is that really. What I'm really asking is, as a political matter for Republicans, does it make any sense to keep this in the top 3 to 5 issues that Republicans are always harping on in a time when, you know, at least the data that we've seen shows that it's inconsequential and the principle itself doesn't seem to be violated, at least not on any scale that would matter? Does it make sense as a political issue?
Well, first of all, I find the New York Times to be a fake news source that's highly suspicious. But
well, it may not be the only source I consulted.
With that said, Heritage I have a lot more confidence in. So if it turns out that this is true, and I suspect it is true, my immediate reaction is one of enormous relief. It makes me enormously relieved to know that this isn't happening. But again, the Republican Party has let me rephrase that. The conservative movement in this country has an amazing message of freedom and responsibility under the law. And this remarkably simple idea is constantly undermined and watered down and destroyed by politicians who can't sell freedom to free people. They're just incapable of it. It's not about the voter ID. It's about the law. It's about citizenship. Now you can talk all you want to about whether or not there's any election fraud, and I'm happy to know that there's not nearly as much as some people think. You can't deny that there are 1,500 people coming over the border every single night illegally, right? So the ID issue is connected to, maybe they shouldn't connect it to voter fraud. I don't know what they want to connect it to, Scotty, but this idea that we shouldn't care, it's not a problem so we shouldn't care. It's not a problem so that we shouldn't do our civic responsibilities. It's not a problem so that fill in the blank. I don't buy it. It's a responsibility. And by the way, if this is such a impediment to poor people. My understanding is that in the biggest democracy in the world, India, where they have 1.5 billion people, it's 5 times our population or so, and most of them in rank poverty, dirt floor poverty. Everybody there who has to vote has a picture ID, and they manage to get them somehow.
Well, voter fraud is an extraordinarily high-risk, low-reward crime. And to pull it off, you have to stand in front of people from the neighborhood, people who've typically been working the polls for years, and then claim that you're somebody you're not, and hope that the real person doesn't show up and invalidate your vote. How many people are willing to risk 5 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine to tally one more for old Hillary Clinton? The data shows nearly no one. In fact, if you want to manipulate elections, it's easier to do it with absentee ballots, which is why that's the issue in far more election fraud cases documented by Heritage. I understand the need to govern on principle, and I know it lays down a marker that we stand for the rule of law, but there are other principles Republicans might want to consider. How about going after corrupt government and party officials instead of adding a regulatory burden to individuals? How about assuming that people will behave honestly until they prove otherwise? The truth is that far more votes are affected by typos, misread signatures, and other bureaucratic mistakes than by anyone trying to impersonate another voter. And since Republicans get all lathered up about the racially tinged issue of voter ID, but lack the zeal to pursue the mostly white crime of absentee ballot abuse, it sure does seem like race plays a part, even if it doesn't. You don't have to abandon your principles to adopt a bit of common sense. Republicans should put voter ID laws on a back burner and focus on making a difference for the almost entirely legal voters who sent them to Washington to limit the intrusion of government in our lives. Let's take another bludgeon out of the Democrats' hands and welcome another legion of voters to the Liberty Battalion. For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the entire Right Angle team, I'm Scott Ott. Thank you to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.